The sound was small. That was the thing no one who was there would ever quite be able to explain afterward. How something so small, the quiet, clean tear of old silk giving way at a seam, could silence a room full of the most powerful wolves in the territory. One moment the music was playing, the candles were burning. Hundreds of eyes were moving through the ceremonial chamber, the way eyes move at important gatherings, calculating, performing, deciding. And then the sound came, soft as a whisper, final as a verdict, and every single eye turned. She stood in the center of the chamber, with both hands pressed against torn ivory fabric, her lace collar still perfect, her spine still straight, her dark eyes dry in a way that cost her more than anyone in that room would ever understand. She did not run. She did not weep. She did not give the room the satisfaction of watching her break. But she was shaking. Beneath the stillness, beneath the careful composure she had spent 3 years building like a wall around herself, she was shaking in a way she could not stop. And then the music stopped, and then he moved. 5 days earlier she had arrived at Kingston Hall, carrying someone else's garment bags through a surface entrance while her stepsisters descended from the main vehicle in silk and certainty. Their names already in the selection register, their futures already being shaped by the most important event the territory had seen in a generation. Her name was not in any register. She was not supposed to matter. She had spent 3 years learning not to. This is the story of what happens when one honest man refuses to look past you. The candle had been burning for 3 hours before the rest of the Montgomery household stirred. Scarlett knew this because she had lit it herself just after 2 in the morning, when the house was quiet enough to hear the pine trees outside pressing against the October wind. She had not slept. There had not been time for sleep. Madison's ceremonial gown needed the left side seam adjusted before dawn, and the lace trim at the collar had come loose in 2 places, and Adelaide— No, Madison, she corrected herself silently. It was always Madison now. It had been Madison for 3 years. Would notice every single imperfection before the sun was fully up. Scarlett's back was straight, not from comfort, from habit. The kind of habit that forms when you have been sitting in cold rooms doing careful work since before you were old enough to understand that this was not how it was supposed to be. The gown spread across her lap was not hers. It had never been hers. It was deep crimson with silver detailing at the collar and cuffs, the sort of color that announces itself before its wearer enters the room, the sort of gown that cost more careful hours of alteration than Scarlett cared to count. The needle moved through the lace with the precise, practiced steadiness of hands that had learned long ago that small mistakes have large consequences. The needle pricked her right forefinger. Not the first time tonight. She blotted the mark on the small square of cloth she kept in her apron pocket, because not a single drop of her blood was allowed near Madison's silk. She had learned that lesson in the first month after her father died, when a single pale pink thread had earned her a week of silence, so cold it had its own temperature. She did not think about the pain in her hands. She had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a noise that never changes. The deep, settled ache of fingers that had been working since girlhood without rest was simply part of her now, part of the landscape of her days. Outside, the pine trees shifted again. A branch scraped the side of the house. Scarlett thought of her father. She often thought of her father in the hours before the household woke, when the world was quiet enough that his voice had room to come back to her. Daniel Montgomery had been a mid-ranked wolf of extraordinary warmth. The kind of man who moved through the world leaving things slightly better than he found them, not through grand gestures, but through small ones. The kind of man who noticed when someone's cup was empty, who remembered the names of people others forgot. who believed all the way down to the place where a person keeps the things they are most certain of, that how you treated people when no one was watching was the truest measure of who you were. He used to say it in the evenings, when the fire had burned low and the Montgomery forest was quiet, and she was young enough to sit on the porch steps beside him, without it meaning anything more than being near someone safe. A true Luna is not made by bloodline or rank, Scarlet. She is made by what she does when the pack is not watching. He had said it the way he said everything he truly believed, not as a lesson being taught, but as a thing already settled. A fact of the world he was simply passing along, a gift pressed into her hands because something in him must have known, even then, that she was going to need it long before she understood why. He had been 53 years old when his heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in November. He had been folding laundry. The ordinariness of it had never stopped being the thing that hurt most. That a man that size, that much warmth, that much genuine presence could simply not be there anymore in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Scarlet had been 19. She was 22 now. 3 years was long enough to learn a great many things. It was long enough to understand that a house you grow up in can become a place where you no longer belong. It was long enough to understand that courtesy, extended only for the sake of one person, dissolves completely the moment that person is gone. Victoria Montgomery, her stepmother, had been courteous for exactly as long as Daniel Montgomery was alive. Not warm. Scarlet did not think she had ever experienced warmth from Victoria. Not genuinely, but courteous. The way a woman is courteous to something she has decided is harmless. The way you are polite to furniture you didn't choose. After the burial, the courtesy had dissolved the way morning frost dissolves. Quickly, completely, and without any drama at all, as though it had never been there. Within a month, Victoria had the household accounts. Within 6 weeks, the room Scarlet had grown up in. A good room, at the back of the house, looking out over the meadow and the tree line, was being used for storage. Scarlet's things were moved to the smaller room near the utility space, the one with the single window that looked out onto the side wall of the neighboring building, and let in grey light for approximately 2 hours each afternoon. She was no longer introduced as a daughter at pack gatherings. She was simply present, an extra body in the house that could carry bags and press gowns and lay fires and manage the accounts she had been taught to read, all those evenings at the kitchen table with her father and a worn ledger between them, at least until Victoria decided that a girl with no rank and no standing had no use for ledgers and had the books locked away in the study where Scarlet was not supposed to go. Madison was 25 now, and beautiful in the precise, curated way of women who have never had reason to doubt their own value. She had her mother's cheekbones and her mother's calculation, and a voice that could be sweet or sharp with equal ease, and she deployed each according to what the situation required. She had accepted Scarlet's offer of her favorite charm bracelet at age 12 and snapped it on her wrist and never said thank you and lost it within the week. She had not changed in any meaningful way since then. She had simply grown more practiced. Zoe was 23, prettier than her sister in a softer, less architectural way, and crueler in the small, impulsive ways of someone who does something unkind before thinking, and then regrets it without correcting it. She had the grace to look sorry sometimes. She had never once done anything about it. This was the household Scarlet moved through every morning, not servant in title. Something worse. A daughter the family had decided to forget while keeping useful. The invitation to the lunar selection arrived on a grey Tuesday morning in October. Scarlet was arranging the breakfast things near the sideboard when Victoria opened the envelope. The Kingston crest was pressed into the dark wax seal, a wolf's head over a crossed pair of keys. Victoria read the letter once. then again. Then she set it down on the table, with both hands flat on either side of it, in the way she always did when she was deciding how something could be turned to use. Alpha King Nicholas Kingston had summoned a small and particular group of pack families to Kingston Hall for a private 5-day Luna selection. He would choose his Luna from among the candidates. The invitation was not public. This was not a general assembly. The families selected were specific. The Montgomerys were among them. Madison went very still in the careful way of someone who has already begun to plan. Zoe's fingers curled against the edge of her saucer. Scarlett kept her eyes on the coffee pot. Victoria allowed herself the smallest of smiles before she spoke. She said that Madison and Zoe would attend as candidates. She said the gowns must be perfect. She said everything needed to be managed with precision. Then she looked across the room. "You will come with us," she said to Scarlett. Her voice was even and entirely pleasant, the way it always was when she had decided something that would cost Scarlett, something she had not offered. Not as a guest. "You will manage the trunks, attend to the gowns, handle any necessary repairs, and remain available to your sisters at all times. You will not present yourself to anyone in that house as anything other than the household attendant. You will not speak unless spoken to." She paused. "Am I clear?" "Yes, ma'am," Scarlett said. The conversation continued without her. It did not need her. She refilled Madison's cup, and then Zoe's, and when she left the breakfast room, no one said goodbye or thank you, because they had not done so in 3 years, and did not begin now. In the 4 days before departure, the Montgomery house became a controlled storm of preparation. Madison's gowns filled 3 garment bags. Zoe's filled 2. There were shoes to be resoled and gloves to be cleaned, and hat boxes to be wrapped, and correspondence to manage, and calling cards to organize. And Scarlett did all of it, in the brief intervals between everything else, without complaint and without being thanked. On the last evening before the journey, she packed her own things. A single worn duffel bag, the one that had been her father's, with a fraying strap she had mended twice with careful thread and determination. Inside, 2 changes of plain clothing, her sewing kit, the small packet of needles she always kept close, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of clean cloth, the ivory dress. It had been her mother's, altered over the years to fit Scarlett's different frame. The fabric was soft with age, the color a little faded from ivory to the warm shade of something old and genuinely loved. The lace collar was handmade and the finest thing she owned, and she had worn it exactly twice. Once at her father's memorial service, when the weight of grief had made everything feel far away, and once at a winter solstice gathering, when the family had briefly been the shape of something whole, back when Daniel was alive, and the word family still meant what it was supposed to mean. She stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the collection of bags waiting by the door. 3 garment bags and 2 trunks for Madison. 2 garment bags and a trunk for Zoe. 1 worn duffel bag for her. She picked up her bag. She went to bed. She did not know yet that the gown at the bottom of that bag would be the gown that changed everything. She did not know that 5 days from now she would be standing in a ceremonial chamber with every powerful wolf in the meat territory watching her, and that the thing she would be remembered for in Kingston Hall would not be any of Madison's alterations or Zoe's perfectly pressed silk. She did not know any of it. She just went to bed. The road to Kingston Territory took most of a day. Scarlett rode in a separate vehicle. This had been Victoria's arrangement, quiet and efficient as all of Victoria's arrangements were. The family traveled in the Montgomery car, which was well maintained and comfortable, and Scarlett traveled in a hired vehicle with the luggage, and the garment bags propped carefully on the seat beside her, so they would not be crushed. The driver was a quiet man who smelled of coffee, and said nothing for the first hour, which Scarlet appreciated. She had the cracked window on her left side, and she rested her head against the cool glass and watched the world go by. The autumn countryside moved past in long, slow panels. Bare trees with their branches raised like questions against the pale grey sky. Stone pack markers at the territory lines, worn smooth by decades of weather and hands, a hawk circling over a distant field, with the unhurried patience of something that has learned to trust its own instincts. She thought about the library at Kingston Hall. She had heard her father speak of it once, years ago, the way he spoke of things he admired from a respectful distance. 3,000 volumes, he had said, a collection of territory records going back 4 centuries. Maps, first editions. A reading room with windows that looked out over the forest. She pressed her cold hands together in her lap and allowed herself that single, fragile thought. The library, the books on those shelves, the idea of standing in a room that had been built specifically to hold knowledge, where knowledge was treated as something valuable enough to deserve that kind of space. Then she set the thought aside. She was not going to Kingston Hall for the library. She was going to carry bags and press gowns and remain invisible. She had heard enough about Alpha King Nicholas Kingston in the weeks before the journey to form a picture of the man before she ever laid eyes on him. The pack community had strong opinions about him. None of them mild. He was cold, they said. He did not perform warmth for the benefit of an audience. He had dismissed 2 candidate families from a northern selection, gathering the previous season without explanation, and when one of the family's matriarchs had pressed for a reason, he had given one in exactly 7 words that no one who heard them had repeated since. He had once silenced an entire formal dinner with 5 quiet words when a ranked wolf spoke cruelly to a low-ranking attendant, and while no one could quite recall what the words had been, everyone who had been there remembered the silence that followed. He was looking for a Luna, but no one seemed entirely certain what kind. He was handsome, this was said reluctantly, as though it was slightly beside the point. Dark-haired and controlled, with the kind of stillness that made people around him uncomfortably aware of how much unnecessary movement they made. He moved through rooms like someone who had never had reason to hurry, because things generally arranged themselves before he reached them. Scarlet thought this sounded like either a very admirable man or a very difficult one. She supposed it might be both. She was not thinking about him. She reminded herself of this firmly. The rest stop came after about 4 hours. A fuel station and a small roadhouse just inside the territory border where travelers could rest and the vehicles could be refueled. The Montgomery car was already parked when Scarlet's hired vehicle pulled in. Through the window of the roadhouse, she could see Victoria and the girls seated in the private dining area, cups in hand, talking with the contained energy of women focused on a purpose. Scarlet had not been invited to the private dining area. She ate the sandwich she had packed for herself, sitting on a low wall near the side of the building, with the autumn wind at her back and the forecourt spread out in front of her. The forecourt was busy. Several other vehicles were stopped for fuel, and the station staff moved efficiently between them. A young Omega girl, perhaps 15, with a round, worried face and hands that were slightly too large for the rest of her, was crossing the forecourt with a tray of drinks, navigating her way carefully between the parked vehicles. Scarlet watched her and thought, without meaning to, of herself at 15. The uneven seam in the forecourt pavement caught the edge of the girl's boot. The tray tilted. 2 cups slid to the ground and shattered against the concrete. The girl went completely still, her face draining of color, her eyes fixed on the broken pieces at her feet. With the look of someone calculating consequences, she had no idea how to survive. From the window of the roadhouse above, a bright voice floated down. "Oh, how extraordinary! Did you see that?" And then laughter, light and easy, and completely indifferent to the girl, standing frozen in the middle of the forecourt with shattered cups around her feet. Scarlet was already moving. She crossed the forecourt in quick, quiet strides, crouched down beside the girl, and began gathering the larger pieces of broken ceramic, careful to avoid the sharp edges. "Don't look at the window," she said quietly. "Look at me. Are your hands all right?" The girl looked at her with enormous wet eyes. "I'll lose my position. These are the good cups. They're for the guests." "The cups are broken," Scarlet said simply. "They cannot be unbroken. What matters now is that you don't cut your hands on them." She helped the girl to her feet, steered her toward the side entrance of the roadhouse, and quietly asked a staff member for a cloth and a dustpan. She stayed to help clear the mess before anyone had the opportunity to make the girl feel worse about it. She did not make it a production. She simply stayed until the girl's hands had stopped shaking and the forecourt was clean. She did not notice the man standing on the far side of the forecourt. He was tall and dressed in a dark coat, standing with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to taking in large amounts of information at once, without appearing to do so. He was not a staff member. He was not a passing traveler. He had the bearing of someone who occupied space rather than merely standing in it. The specific, settled quality of a man who has never had cause to wonder whether he belonged somewhere. His eyes were dark and his face was controlled, and he had been watching Scarlet from the moment she left the wall. One of the Kingston vehicles was parked across the forecourt. His beta, Alexander Sterling, stood near it and saw exactly what his alpha saw. Neither of them said anything. Nicholas Kingston turned, got back into the vehicle, and closed the door. But the reader knows, even if Scarlet does not, that something had just been decided. That the selection for this particular alpha had already quietly begun. Kingston Hall appeared at the end of a long gravel drive that curved through ancient pine forest before revealing the house. Even through the smudged window of the hired vehicle, even in the pale October afternoon light, Scarlet felt the breath leave her body quietly. It did not look like a home. It looked like something that had been built to last, and had, and intended to keep doing so. Ancient stone with mullioned windows that caught the weak light and turned it silver. A roofline with chimneys and carved stonework that had weathered several centuries without softening. The Kingston crest above every archway. The wolf's head and crossed keys, repeated in stone and iron and silver thread throughout the grounds. Servants moved across the grounds with the quiet efficiency of people who had been trained not to be noticed. Other vehicles were arriving through the main entrance. Through those windows, Scarlet could see silk and ceremony, the assembled candidates and their families descending with the careful confidence of people who believed they had every right to be there. Scarlet stepped out of the hired vehicle at the service entrance on the far side of the house. She was shown to the staff quarters by a young Omega attendant named Nora. Perhaps 17, with a round, earnest face, and the instinct to apologize when bumped into from behind. Nora moved through Kingston Hall's corridors with the ease of someone who had lived in them for several years, pointing out the linen room and the back stairs and the narrow passage that connected the staff wing to the main corridor near the ceremonial chamber. "And that door on the far left," Nora said, pausing, "leads toward the library if you turn right and then right again." Scarlet looked at the door on the far left. She told herself very firmly that she would not think about it. That evening, the guests assembled in the great hall for the formal welcome ceremony. Scarlet was required to remain close to Madison and Zoe. She positioned herself near a pillar at the edge of the hall, pressed flat enough against it to be properly out of the way, but with a clear view of the room. The hall was long and high-ceilinged, with silver candelabras casting warm amber light across the polished stone floor and the assembled guests below. Silk and ceremony, and the careful energy of people performing their best selves in a room where it mattered. Then Alpha King Nicholas Kingston came down the central staircase. He was exactly what the rumors had constructed, and the construction had not been adequate. Dark-haired, controlled, handsome in the way that is not about individual features, but about the whole of a person, the way they hold themselves, the specific quality of their attention, the sense that they are always seeing considerably more than they appear to be. He descended the staircase at the measured pace of a man who has never had reason to rush, and the room, without being asked, went quiet. He greeted Victoria. He acknowledged Madison with cool civility. He acknowledged Zoe with equal distance. The formalities continued, and then his gaze, moving through the assembled figures in the hall, passed over Scarlett. It lasted less than 2 seconds. It was not remarkable. It moved on, but Scarlett felt it the way you feel an unexpected source of warmth on a cold day, sudden, present, and gone before you could be certain it was real. A brief, distinct awareness of being located, of existing specifically in the exact space she occupied. She pressed her back against the pillar. She reminded herself firmly what she was here for. Later that night, in the staff corridor, in the narrow bed of her assigned room, she lay looking at the ceiling and thought about the door on the far left that led toward the library. She told herself she would not go in. She was almost entirely certain. The first formal dinner was held on the evening of the first full day, and every woman seated at the long Kingston table arrived expecting to be assessed for her beauty and her composure and the elegance with which she carried herself through a formal meal. Nicholas Kingston had other things in mind. Scarlett watched from the attendants' anteroom off the far end of the dining room, a small space with a door left slightly open, from which she could see the entire table without being part of it. She kept one eye on the room and one eye on Zoe's gown clasp, which had been loose when they left the Montgomery rooms and which she intended to address the moment it failed, because it would fail, and it would happen at the worst possible moment, because that was how these things worked. The candidates had arranged themselves with the careful precision of people who understood that everything they did tonight was being evaluated. Madison sat 3 places from the head of the table, composed and beautiful, with the serene expression of someone who has practiced this specific situation. Enough that it no longer produces anxiety, only performance. Zoe sat further down, bright-eyed and effortful, her smile just slightly wider than it needed to be. Nicholas sat at the head of the table and said very little through the first 2 courses. Enough to confirm he was capable of polite conversation, not so much as to suggest he intended to make it easy. When the 3rd course had been cleared, he set down his glass and addressed the assembled table with the directness of someone who does not believe in lengthy approaches. "I should be plain," he said, "about what I am looking for." The room sharpened its attention. A Luna of Kingston manages an estate that directly affects the lives of several hundred wolves. She oversees pack welfare and makes decisions about territory and resources. She protects those who have less standing than she does with judgment and courage, not with performance. He paused. "She is someone this pack can trust to act well when I am not in the room. Beauty and bloodline are neither obstacles nor sufficient qualifications." A silence followed. Victoria's hands pressed flat on the table. Something shifted behind Madison's composed expression, like a single piece of furniture moved half an inch. Zoe's bright eyes found her mother's face. The dinner resumed. The trouble came before the final course. Nora, the young attendant who had shown Scarlett to her room the previous afternoon, was crossing the dining room with a serving pitcher when her boot caught the edge of the carpet runner. A small amount of liquid caught the sleeve of Zoe's pale gown. It was a small accident. The kind of thing that happens in rooms where people are moving around, hot food and fragile things, and the stakes are high, enough that hands tremble slightly. Zoe's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was sharp and clear, and everyone heard it. "Good heavens, can you not manage a single pitcher?" Madison said nothing. She simply turned her gaze toward Nora with an expression that communicated both disdain and boredom simultaneously, which was somehow more terrible than any words. Nora went rigid, white-faced, the kind of apology that has no words because it runs too deep for them. Nicholas set down his glass. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He simply spoke into the silence, in the controlled, precise way of a man who chooses each word the way a skilled craftsman chooses a tool. "A woman who mistakes rank for permission," he said quietly, "has misunderstood both." The words fell across the table like stones into still water. The silence that followed was thorough and complete. Zoe's color rose. Madison studied her plate with sudden interest. Victoria's hands pressed flat on either side of her silverware. Several of the other guests found their own napkins abruptly fascinating. Nora was quietly excused by the head of household. In the anteroom doorway, Scarlett pressed one hand flat against the doorframe and held very still. She had spent 3 years watching powerful people look away from small cruelties. She had absorbed so many small cruelties of her own that she had developed a kind of numbness toward them. Not indifference, exactly, but the practical skill of not being destroyed by each individual blow. She had learned that people with power generally used it in the direction of their own comfort. She was not used to a man who looked directly at the thing. Later, when the dinner guests had moved to the drawing rooms and the dining room was being cleared, Scarlett went looking for Nora. She found her in the staff corridor, still trembling in the particular way of someone who has swallowed a great deal of distress and is trying to keep it down by force of will. Scarlett sat beside her on the wooden bench and gave her a handkerchief, clean, carefully kept, edged with worn but honest lace, and said nothing for a moment, because sometimes silence is more kind than words. When Nora had swallowed twice and pressed the cloth against her face, Scarlett said quietly, "An accident doesn't define you. It only reveals what the people around you are made of." Nora pressed the handkerchief harder against her face. "They looked at me like I was nothing," she whispered. "I know," Scarlett said. "I know exactly how that feels." She stayed until the girl had stopped shaking and had returned enough of her composure to move through the rest of the evening. She did not make it a performance. She did not expect anything from it. She simply stayed because the girl needed someone to stay. She did not know that Nicholas Kingston had come through the back passage from his study and had stopped when he heard her voice. Low and steady in the staff corridor, the specific sound of someone giving comfort without an audience. She did not see him standing in the shadow further down the hall, watching her with the particular attention of a man who has just had something confirmed that he had already suspected. He stood there longer than was necessary, then he walked away. On the third day, Nicholas arranged what his household referred to as a territory welfare hearing. Families from the outer Kingston settlements were brought before the assembled selection candidates. A farming family whose harvest had failed due to drought. A couple from the southern edge of the territory, whose healer's cottage had been reported for repairs twice without action. A family with a young pup who had been ill since the summer solstice, with no proper medical attention accessible within reasonable distance. A territorial boundary dispute between two mid-ranked families that had been waiting for resolution for nearly a year. These were real problems, real people, real consequences. The candidates were invited to offer their thoughts. Madison spoke with perfect composure. She expressed genuine-sounding concern. She mentioned the importance of pack welfare, the duty of the higher ranked toward the lower. She said everything in the correct order and with the appropriate tone. She said nothing that engaged with any specific problem that had been placed before her. Zoe was warmer in delivery and equally vague in substance. She thought the families were very brave to come forward. She believed something ought to be done about the healer's cottage. She smiled at the farming family's eldest son. He thanked her with polite, carefully managed disappointment. The pack resource records were then distributed, a quarterly accounting of Kingston's territory assets and yield, a visual aid for the discussion, Alexander Sterling explained. Scarlett sat near the wall behind Madison, holding a spare sash that no one had needed. She was not here to participate. She was here to be useful and invisible, and to return to the staff wing when the session ended. She opened the records document, because it was in front of her, and she was her father's daughter, and she could not help it. She found the error on the third column within 2 minutes. It was quiet, not dramatic. The recorded grain yield for the southern settlement fields did not account for the drought damage that the farming family had just described. The damage report would have revised that figure downward by a meaningful amount. If the figure went to the Territory Council uncorrected, it would present a surplus, where there was a genuine deficit. A difference that would affect the distribution of winter resources across the settlement families. Scarlett sat very still and said nothing. She was not here to speak. She had been told very clearly the exact nature and limits of her presence in this house. Then Grace Prescott, a gentle, quiet girl of 19, seated near the end of the candidate row. A girl who had the careful manners of someone taught to be considerate, and who had been watching Scarlett for the better part of the morning with a certain thoughtful attention, leaned very slightly back in her chair and caught Scarlett's eye. She mouthed it silently, barely a breath of movement. The numbers. What does it mean? Scarlett looked at the records. She looked at Grace. She looked at the room. Then she leaned forward and murmured it, as quietly as she could manage. The discrepancy, the drought loss, what it would mean if the figure was uncorrected. She had not meant to be heard by anyone but Grace. Miss Scarlett. Nicholas Kingston's voice did not rise. It simply made everything around it quieter, the way a still point makes moving things more aware of their own motion. Every head in the room turned. He was looking at her. Not at Madison, who had straightened in her chair with an expression of perfect control and complete fury. Not at the assembled candidates. At Scarlett directly, with the full weight of his attention. What did you observe in the records? The room was completely still. Victoria's hands were flat on her lap. Scarlett was aware of this without looking. She stood. She did not grip the chair back. She did not look at Victoria. The yield figure on the third column represents the harvest income for the southern settlement fields, she said, keeping her voice steady. But the drought that the Harrison family described affected that crop in late summer, and the damage report submitted in August would have revised that number downward by approximately 15 to 18%. If the August report hasn't been incorporated, the column total will show a surplus when the actual position is a deficit. It would affect how resources are allocated to those families over the winter months. A silence. Alexander Sterling looked at the records. He looked at Nicholas. Then he said, with the careful precision of a man who respects accuracy above all things, "She is correct, Alpha." Nix let the silence hold for 1 moment more. "Miss Scarlett Montgomery," he said, "your observation has prevented an error that would have reached the Territory Council uncorrected. The settlement families are obliged to you." The room absorbed this. An attendant named, thanked by the Alpha King. In front of every candidate family, every watching elder, Every person in this room who had looked at Scarlet and seen a girl carrying someone else's bags. The whispers that followed were very soft. They were also very fast. Scarlet sat back down. She kept her spine straight and her eyes on the middle distance and did not look at Victoria, though she could feel Victoria's attention from 8 feet away like a cold draft beneath a closed door. Victoria found her before she had reached the corridor. Her voice when she spoke was very soft. It was always softest when it was most dangerous. "You would do well to remember why you are here," Victoria said. "The Alpha acknowledged you. That is all. Men in his position do not choose girls without rank or standing. If he notices you, it is novelty. If he is kind, it is pity." She paused. "Do not mistake a powerful man's passing attention for anything it is not. Your father would not have wanted you to embarrass this family by reaching beyond your station. I trust you understand that." Scarlet said nothing. There was nothing she could say that would improve her position. She had learned long ago that the safest response to Victoria's softest voice was silence and a steady gaze. Victoria read the gaze correctly. She moved away. Scarlet pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the corridor and breathed. Victoria was probably right about the arithmetic. She knew the social calculation that placed her at the absolute bottom of this room. Packless, without rank or standing, brought here to hold other women's accessories. But she also knew, with a certainty that frightened her slightly, that the way Nicholas had said her name, Miss Scarlett Montgomery, as though it was a name worth saying, was not pity. She had received pity before. She knew what it felt like. It felt like being seen from above. This had felt like being seen face to face. On the 4th morning, Madison announced that she had left her ceremonial sash somewhere in the main corridor, and Scarlet should retrieve it before the afternoon session. Scarlet went. She took a wrong turn at the second junction. Kingston Hall's interior was a network of corridors that connected and branched in ways that took time to learn, and then another wrong turn. And then she stopped in a doorway that she had not been looking for and had no particular right to be standing in. The Kingston Private Library. She had told herself she would not go in. She had held that conviction for 4 days with genuine, sincere determination. She had walked past this section of the hall twice, and both times had continued walking with the discipline of someone who has learned that wanting things they cannot have is an expense they cannot afford. She went in. The room was everything her father had described, and considerably more than her imagination had added to his description. 3 walls floor to ceiling in dark walnut shelving, the wood worn smooth with age and polish and decades of careful handling. A rolling brass ladder on a rail that curved around 2 walls, a globe on a mahogany stand near the window, the one her father had mentioned, the Naval Admiral's globe, enormous and dark with age, and marked with territories and sea routes that no longer matched any current map. 2 reading tables with green-shaded lamps. A fireplace with a small, well-tended fire burning in the afternoon light, and above the mantel, a portrait of a man with dark hair and a controlled expression wearing clothes from another century who bore such a thorough resemblance to the current Alpha King that it was clear the Kingston line had been producing the same face for several generations and had never apparently seen any need to apologize for it. Scarlet walked the length of the first shelf with her fingertips barely touching the spines, not reading the titles, just feeling the texture of knowing that they existed, that somewhere in this room there was likely an answer to every question she had ever wanted to ask, and enough questions she had not yet thought of to keep her occupied for a lifetime. She stopped at a volume on territory management and resource allocation, a topic she knew something about, courtesy of her father and his worn kitchen ledger and all those evenings of patient explanation. and pulled it gently from the shelf. She had been standing there perhaps 3 minutes, turning pages with careful hands, when she heard the door. She turned. Nicholas Kingston stood in the library doorway. She was already apologizing before she had fully registered what she was saying. The words came out in a quick, flat stream. "I beg your pardon. I took a wrong turn. I should not be here. I will leave immediately." With the practiced efficiency of someone who has apologized for existing in rooms that weren't hers often enough to have developed a formula for it. "Do you read?" His voice stopped her. Simple, direct, entirely without the particular tone that people usually used with her. In rooms like this, the slight lifting of something at the end that meant you don't quite belong here, do you? "Scarlett," she said before she had quite decided to. "Scarlett Montgomery. Yes. My father taught me. He thought it was important." Nicholas crossed the room at the same unhurried pace he brought to everything, and took the volume from her hands with a care that suggested he handled books the way careful people handle things that matter. He looked at the spine. "Territory management," he said. "He started showing me the pack ledgers when I was 14, she said, and then caught herself, because she had not quite intended to say that much, and the information sat between them with the slightly too personal quality of something offered before trust has fully formed. "I know it is not my place. I should not have come in. Knowledge was never meant to be rationed by rank," he said. He handed the book back. She looked at him. The fire moved between them. Outside the library windows, rain had begun against the glass, a soft, steady sound that made the room feel smaller and warmer and more private than it technically was. "What happened after your father died?" he asked. "With the ledgers?" She kept her voice level. This was a skill she had developed with considerable effort over 3 years, the ability to discuss things that had cost her something without letting the cost show in her voice. Victoria felt it was not appropriate, that a girl without standing or prospects had no practical use for that kind of knowledge. He was quiet for a moment. His gaze moved to her hands, specifically to her right forefinger and thumb, where the needle marks from 3 nights of careful work were still faintly visible. She saw him look and folded her hands together quietly, the way she always did. The reflex of someone who has learned to keep the evidence of labor out of sight. He did not press, but something in his expression, which was always controlled, always measured, tightened slightly in a way that had nothing to do with displeasure at her. "The sash you are looking for," he said after a moment, "is in the drawing room on the east side. Nora will take you there." "Thank you," she said. She was already moving toward the door, the book still in her hands. She had held it longer than she'd meant to. "Miss Scarlett," she turned. "You may use this library whenever the household's demands allow it," he said. "I would prefer that the books in this room were read." She stood in the doorway for a moment. She did not have the language for what she felt. It was too large and too unexpected, and she was not certain she trusted it yet. "Thank you," she said again quietly. She left. She did not see Madison at the far end of the corridor, watching her walk away with her chin up and her cheeks faintly warm. She did not see Nicholas appear in the library doorway a moment later, watching after her with an expression that Madison could not fully read but recognized immediately as something she had not anticipated and could not afford to allow. For the first time in 3 years, Scarlett was not invisible. To Madison, this was not an observation. It was a problem. That evening in the shared Montgomery sitting room, Madison set a single sheet of Kingston Hall stationery at the edge of the writing desk. It had come from the household supply left in the corridor that morning. She smoothed it flat with 2 careful fingers and looked at it for a moment. Zoe sat across the room watching her. "What are we doing?" Zoe said. "We are removing a problem," Madison said, "before it has time to become one." Zoe was quiet. She looked at the stationery and then at her sister, and then at her own hands. Madison, he's looking for something. Whatever it is, she is somehow showing it to him, Madison said, and that cannot continue. Zoe said nothing more. The trap was quiet when it was set. Most traps are. The fifth and final evening arrived, the way important evenings arrive, with the particular quality of air that suggests the atmosphere itself knows something is about to matter. Scarlett dressed in the East Wing guest room. The guest room had been quietly arranged for her 2 days ago, without explanation and without fanfare. She had arrived at the staff quarters after the afternoon session to find Nora waiting in the corridor with a small smile and a set of keys, and the information that Mrs. Hannah Sterling, the warm-faced woman who ran the Kingston household, with the quiet authority of someone who has been doing it well for a long time, had moved her things. No formal explanation had been given to Victoria. Scarlett had not asked for one. She stood before the proper mirror of the East Wing room, larger and clearer than anything in the staff wing, and put on her mother's ivory dress. The fabric was soft, the way old things are soft, not fragile, but settled into itself, the way a house settles into its foundation over decades. The lace collar was handmade, and it was, she thought, with a clarity that had nothing of self-pity in it, the finest thing she owned. She had worn it to her father's memorial, and she had worn it to a winter solstice gathering the year he died, when the family had briefly, impossibly, been the shape of something whole. She looked at herself in the mirror. Not quickly, not with the evaluating speed she usually used, but steadily. Pale face, dark hair pinned with care, hands that showed evidence of work. She looked like herself. She had not, she realized, looked like herself in quite some time. The ceremonial chamber of Kingston Hall was the kind of room that made you understand why the building had been worth constructing. The ceiling soared 2 stories above a polished stone floor, and the full moon poured silver light through a series of high glass panels along the east wall, laying long silver rectangles across the floor, and the assembled guests below like something ceremonial and deliberate. The Kingston crest was repeated in silver thread on the ceremony banners, and the candelabras cast warm amber light that mixed with the cold silver of the moonlight into something that was neither one nor the other, but something genuinely beautiful. Every alpha delegate in the territory was present, every pack elder, every family of standing who had received an invitation, which was to say the families that mattered by the specific calculation of people who kept careful records of who mattered. The candidates moved through the room with the practiced energy of people performing their final, most important performance. Madison moved with the natural authority of someone who has never doubted her own right to occupy space, working the room with the smooth, unhurried precision of a person who has been practicing this exact situation her entire life. Zoe was bright and warm and slightly more anxious than her composure covered, her eyes moving constantly. Nicholas stood to the right of the throne dais, watching the room with the contained attention he brought to everything. His gaze moved through the assembly, noting, assessing, confirming. Twice, it found the figure near the east archway, not with the general sweep he gave the rest of the room. With the specific, settled attention of a man who already knows what he is looking at. Grace Prescott found Scarlett near the side archway at the beginning of the second hour, pale-faced and gripping her ceremony program with both hands. "I think I am going to be unwell," Grace said, with the quiet desperation of someone fighting a losing battle with their own nerves. "Breathe," Scarlett said. "Slowly. There is no shortcut." She guided Grace to a seat against the wall, pressed a glass of water into her hands, and stayed beside her until the color returned and the program stopped rattling. "Better? You are very calm," Grace said. "I have had practice," Scarlett said, and meant something that Grace, sheltered and kindly raised, and never asked to survive a single day of what Scarlett had survived, could not have fully understood. She straightened. Nicholas was 6 feet away. He had been watching, not with the distracted attention of someone standing nearby. With the look of a man who had positioned himself to observe something specific, and was satisfied with what he had found. He crossed the distance between them. "Miss Scarlett," he said, "I find myself in need of a particular volume from the library that I cannot locate without assistance. As you are the most recent visitor to that room, I wonder if you might help me find it." It was a fiction. She knew it was a fiction. He knew she knew. But it was the kind of careful fiction that allowed her to walk beside him through the ceremonial corridor without causing the kind of remark that a room full of pack elders would take note of. Alexander Sterling materialized at a discreet distance behind them, the invisible chaperone that made everything proper without making it awkward. In the quieter corridor beyond the ceremonial chamber, away from the music and the assembly and the weight of being observed, Nicholas stopped. "I have been watching you," he said, "since the first evening of this selection. No preamble, no softening. Not as an observer of the candidates. As someone trying to understand something I did not yet have words for." Scarlett said nothing. She did not have anything she could safely say. "The girl at the rest stop on the border road," he said. "You did not know anyone was watching. You crossed the forecourt to help her without pausing to decide whether it was worth your time." He paused. "Nora, in the staff corridor after the first dinner. You gave her your own handkerchief and stayed until she had herself back. The records assessment, Miss Prescott tonight." A brief silence. "Every one of those things happened when no one was paying attention, which means you did all of it without an audience." Scarlett found her voice. "I simply did what needed doing." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly the point." Something in the way he said it settled over her like the moment after a long silence when you realize the silence was the thing you had been needing. She did not know how to hold it. She had been taught, slowly and thoroughly, not to hold things like this, not to trust them, not to reach for them. "I should return," she said. "I know," he said. He did not try to stop her, but as she turned toward the corridor, his voice came once more quieter. "Thank you for the conversation, Miss Scarlett." She walked back toward the ceremony. She carried the warmth of what he had said like something too fragile to move quickly with. She did not know that Madison had been watching the corridor entrance. The second hour of the ceremony was when the dancing drew most of the guests toward the center of the chamber, and the edges grew quieter. The shadows near the archways deepened. Madison and Zoe came from opposite sides. They cornered Scarlett's near the stone pillar by the east archway, where the moonlight from the high glass panels did not quite reach. Scarlett felt the shift in the air before she heard them. The particular quality of stillness that comes just before something has been decided. Madison spoke first. Her voice was low and perfectly controlled, the social voice she used when she wanted to be devastating without being visible about it. "Do you know what you are doing?" she said. "Do you genuinely believe that a man like Nicholas Kingston has any real interest in a girl, without rank, without resources, without any standing at all?" Scarlett said nothing. She had learned that speaking during Madison's openings only gave Madison more material. "We found this," Zoe said. She produced a lunar selection token from the folds of Scarlett's ceremonial wrap. Official Kingston stationery, the pack crest, her own name written in a hand that was, she had to admit, very close to her own. The accusation was already in their faces before the word was spoken. "You planted yourself in this house as a candidate," Madison said, her voice carrying now, reaching the guests, beginning to drift toward the archway, while pretending to be nothing more than an attendant. "I did not write that," Scarlett said. Her voice was quiet, completely steady. She kept her eyes on Madison's face. You know that. Zoe's gaze dropped briefly to the floor. Victoria peered at Mattison's side, her expression arranged in wounded, gracious grief, her voice lifting just enough to carry beautifully to the gathering crowd. We brought you here out of kindness, Scarlet. We gave you a place in this family when you had nothing, and this is how you repay our generosity, by inserting yourself where you were never meant to be. The crowd had gathered without quite seeming to. Dozens of faces, all oriented toward the archway, watching with the particular attention of people who went to stand, something that will be discussed for a long time. Scarlet's hands were flat against her sides. She was not going to argue. She was not going to weep. She was not going to give the room the satisfaction of watching her fracture. I did not write that token, she said clearly, for everyone present. I have been here as an attendant. I have not presented myself to anyone as anything else. Madison reached out. Her hand closed around the sleeve of the ivory dress. Her mother's dress, altered and worn, and the only truly fine thing Scarlet owned. The grip was not accidental. Nothing about Madison was accidental. You have been reaching above yourself, Madison said. Zoe's hand, on the other side, found the bodice. Please don't, Scarlet said, very quietly. Like a door closing on something that has no more room to retreat, they pulled. The sound of tearing silk in a room that has gone completely silent is a small sound. In the ceremonial chamber of Kingston Hall, it was enormous. The seam at the shoulder gave first, then the side. Not the dress destroyed entirely, but enough that Scarlet stood in the center of the chamber, with both hands pressed against torn ivory fabric, her lace collar intact, her spine straight, her eyes dry, in front of every powerful wolf in the territory. The music stopped. No one had told the musicians to stop. They simply understood. For one long moment, nothing moved, and then Nicholas moved. He did not hurry. That was the thing the room registered first, before anything else. He did not rush toward her. He did not react with the sharp, urgent energy of someone startled into action. He moved with the quiet, complete authority of someone who had already decided what was going to happen, and was simply crossing the distance to make it so. The crowd parted, not dramatically. Not because anyone consciously stepped aside. Simply because it was not possible to stand in the path of someone moving with that kind of settled certainty. He reached Scarlet. He did not look at Madison. He did not look at Zoe. He did not acknowledge Victoria, or the watching elders, or the assembled guests, or anyone in the chamber, except the one person standing with her hands pressed against torn ivory silk, and her spine perfectly straight, and her eyes dry in a way that cost everything it appeared to cost nothing. He looked at her, steady, direct, with something in it that was not pity. That was the absolute opposite of pity in the specific quality of its steadiness. Pity looks down. This looked straight across. He removed his cloak. It was deep charcoal gray, lined in black silk. The Kingston crest worked in silver thread at the collar, heavy, warm, carrying the scent of pine and cold air, and something that was simply him. The specific warmth of having been worn by someone and offered freely. He placed it around her shoulders. His hands were careful. The clasp at her throat, 2 movements, precise, deliberate. His fingers did not linger, but they were present, and the room saw them, and understood every word of what they were saying. The weight of the cloak settled across Scarlet's shoulders. She had not known she was shaking until the warmth of it made her aware of her own stillness beneath it. The deep, controlled trembling of someone who has been holding themselves together for so long that the first genuinely solid thing the world offers them causes the whole structure to become briefly aware of itself. She was shaking. She stood very still and let the warmth of the cloak absorb it. Nicholas turned to face the room. The silence was total. A family that tears a woman apart to claim a title, he said. has already shown the pack what it is worth." The words fell across the chamber with the finality of something that could not be unsaid and would not be forgotten. Madison opened her mouth. She had a prepared response, the kind of polished, perfectly structured explanation that had served her well in drawing rooms her entire life. It died before it reached words. Something in the stillness of Nicholas's expression, in the absolute absence of anything that could be argued with in it, stopped the words before they formed. Zoe looked at the floor. Victoria's composure held longer than her daughter's. She was a woman of genuine control and 30 years of practice. She produced the forged token. She spoke of evidence. She spoke of misrepresentation. Alexander Sterling stepped forward from the edge of the room. He addressed the assembly in the precise, careful tone of a man who has prepared his words and intends them to be heard clearly. "The token in Lady Victoria's possession was examined this afternoon prior to this evening's ceremony," he said. "The writing on it was compared against correspondence written by Miss Scarlett Montgomery at various points during this selection. The comparison was made with the assistance of Kingston Hall's legal counsel. The token was not written by Miss Scarlett Montgomery. The hand is close in formation, but differs in several consistent ways that indicate a practiced imitation rather than the original writer. Furthermore, the token was produced on Kingston Hall stationery, accessed from the writing desk in the Montgomery ladies' shared sitting room, where no such stationery should have been present had it not been removed from the household supply. The silence that followed this was a different quality, harder, more final, the kind of silence that follows not the delivery of a blow, but the closing of a door. Zoe's head came up sharply. Madison went very still. Nicholas spoke again. The Montgomery party's participation in the selection was concluded. They were welcome to remain through the night as guests, as hospitality required. They would have no further contact with Scarlett before their departure in the morning. He did not need to say it twice. Victoria left the ceremonial chamber with her chin at its usual angle and her steps at their usual measured pace, and her face giving away nothing, because Victoria had never in 30 years allowed her face to give away anything that she had not decided to reveal. Madison followed without looking back. Zoe paused at the edge of the chamber. She turned and looked at Scarlett. Not with triumph, not with apology, but with the face of one standing at the edge of something they went too far across to walk back from. Just for a moment. Then she turned and followed her mother. Hannah Sterling appeared at Scarlett's side with the quiet efficiency of someone who has anticipated this moment and knows exactly what it requires. "Come," she said, "there is a warm room this way." Scarlett let herself be guided. She was still wearing the cloak. She was aware of it the way you are aware of a steadying hand. Not intrusively, not with drama, but without question. Solid. Present. Not going anywhere. The room Hannah brought her to was small and firelit and quiet, with a low armchair by the hearth and a table with a glass of water, and the kind of stillness that feels like the world deciding to hold itself back for a moment and let someone breathe. Goodwin, Alexander Sterling, stood outside the door. Hannah Sterling sat at the edge of the room and said nothing at all, which was, Scarlett thought, exactly the correct thing to say. Nicholas came in some minutes later. He sat across from her, not close enough to speak without raising his voice. He sat with the settled patience of a man who is not in any hurry and does not need to be. Scarlett spoke first. "I am sorry for the disturbance this evening." "You did not cause it," he said. "You survived it." A pause. The fire moved. Outside the small room's single window, the moon was high and still. "I have been watching you since I saw you cross a forecourt to help a girl who had dropped a tray while your family laughed from the window above," he said, quietly, without performance. "I did not introduce myself. I wanted to see what you were when you had no reason to perform anything. Scarlet looked at the fire. I wasn't performing. I know, he said. That was the point. She pressed her hands together in her lap. The thing behind her eyes was not quite tears. It was something older and larger than tears, the specific pressure of emotion that has been held down for so long, and with such discipline, that it does not know how to surface quickly. It rises slowly, like water through stone. Why are you telling me this? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Because you stood in front of that room in a torn dress and did not break, he said, and because no one who holds themselves together with that much care should have to stand clothed in shame for something that was done to them, not in front of any room and not in mine. A pause, and because you have been seen, perhaps not by that room, but by me, since the beginning. The fire moved between them. Scarlet looked at him. The Alpha King with the controlled face and the careful hands and the attention that had been finding her, specifically, since a forecourt at a border rest stop when she had not known anyone was watching, and understood that this was what it felt like when someone looked at you from the same level. Not from above, not through you. Face to face. She had forgotten what that felt like. She was remembering now. She woke the next morning to comfort so unfamiliar that for the first several seconds she did not know where she was. Soft sheets. The kind that have been washed many times and dried in clean air and fold with the particular softness of things that have been cared for. A fire already burning in the grate. Someone had laid it before she stirred. A basin of clean water, and on the small table by the window, a breakfast tray with tea and warm bread, and a small pot of honey that no one had told her she was not allowed to touch. She lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling. Then Nora appeared in the doorway, the girl who had trembled in the staff corridor and received a handkerchief, who now moved through this room with a soft expression and the easy, deliberate care of someone who had asked specifically to be assigned here this morning. "Good morning, Miss Scarlet," Nora said. "Mrs. Sterling asks if you would prefer anything particular for breakfast. And Alpha Nicholas's household wishes you to know that the East Wing guest room is yours for as long as you need it." Scarlet sat up slowly. She held the warm weight of that sentence for a moment. For as long as you need it. Not for now, not while we decide, for as long as she needed it. "Thank you, Nora," she said. She dressed in the clothes that Hannah Sterling had quietly placed in the wardrobe. Clean, well-fitting, in quiet colors that suited her. She looked at herself in the East Wing mirror and saw something she had not seen there on any morning in 3 years. She looked like someone beginning something. The formal meeting was held at 10 in the small study, adjacent to Nicholas's main office. Matthew Prescott, the PAC's legal counsel, was there, a quiet, careful man of middle age, with the manner of someone who has spent his career understanding that clarity is more valuable than speed. Alexander Sterling was present. Hannah Sterling sat at the back of the room and said nothing, but her presence was a kind of statement on its own. Nicholas sat across the table with the particular still attention of a man who has arranged everything he can arrange and now intends to allow events to proceed. Victoria was already seated when Scarlet arrived. She was dressed in her traveling things, which told Scarlet everything about how Victoria had decided to frame this meeting. The composed expression, the correctly held posture, the look of a woman who has managed difficult situations for 30 years and intends to manage this one. Matthew Prescott spoke with the unhurried precision of a man who respects the weight of what he is saying. He confirmed what Alexander Sterling had found. A fund established by Daniel Montgomery in the year before his death, specifically designated for Scarlet's care and her future, a private arrangement created by a father who understood that he was leaving and was doing what he could do about it. The fund had been placed under Victoria's management as Scarlett's named guardian. The current balance of that fund, compared to what should reasonably remain after 3 years of appropriate expenditure on Scarlett's maintenance alone, represented a meaningful discrepancy. The Montgomery household's presentation expenses over the same period, gowns, social preparation, a vehicle, calling cards, the engagement and journey costs associated with the lunar selection, had been considerable. Victoria said, in her smoothest voice, that household expenses were always complex, that maintaining a family involved costs that were not always easy to categorize, that she had done her best for all the children in her care. Matthew Prescott said, with great care, that the fund had been specifically designated for Scarlett's maintenance alone, that its application to general household expenses required formal review. He turned to Scarlett. "Miss Montgomery, you have standing to pursue this through the appropriate legal process. Alpha Kingston's household is prepared to provide counsel and representation if you choose it." Scarlett looked at Victoria. She looked for a long time. Not with anger. Anger was too simple for what she was feeling. She looked with the clear, steady gaze of someone taking an honest inventory of something that has cost them a great deal over a long period of time. Victoria looked back at her, and for just a moment, one moment only, the length of a breath held and released, the composure gave way. Beneath it was something Scarlett had never seen on Victoria's face before. Something that, in a different woman, with a different history, might have been called shame. Then Victoria spoke, and the composure was back, smooth and complete. "I provided for you," she said. "I kept a roof over your head and food on your table." "You had me work for every piece of bread," Scarlett said. Her voice was quiet, not raised, not heated. Simply true, in the way that things are true when they no longer have to be softened for anyone's comfort. "You used me as an unpaid member of your household with my own father's money, and you did it while telling me I should be grateful." The room held that. Victoria pressed her hands flat on the table. She said that society would speak poorly of this, that a girl without standing who pursued a legal matter against her guardian would be seen as ungrateful, that no one of consequence would receive her well. "I have spent 3 years," Scarlett said, "mistaking endurance for duty. I will not do so again." The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. Victoria rose. She straightened her jacket with 2 precise movements. She looked at Scarlett one final time, not with cruelty, not with warmth, but with a particular expression of someone who recognizes they have lost and is determining how to carry the fact of it. She left without another word. The room was quieter when the door closed. Matthew Prescott gathered his documents with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has accomplished what he came to accomplish. Alexander Sterling spoke briefly to Prescott near the window. Hannah Sterling, at the back of the room, pressed her handkerchief briefly to the corner of her eye and replaced it with quiet dignity. "I will pursue the legal matter," Scarlett said to Prescott. "I would like to accept the counsel that has been offered." Prescott nodded. "Very good, Miss Montgomery." When he had gone, and Sterling with him, the room held only Nicholas and Scarlett and the morning light coming through the study window, and the sound of the Kingston forest holding its particular autumn stillness outside. "Are you all right?" Nicholas said. "I'm not certain," she said honestly. "I think I will be." He nodded. He did not rush to fill the space with reassurance, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him in 5 days. He did not offer comfort, he did not mean. He offered space. "What happens now?" she said, the large version of the question. The one that meant more than the legal matter, more than the practical arrangements of the next several weeks. "That depends on what you choose," he said, which is exactly how it should be. She looked at the window, the Kingston forest. Dark pine trunks in the morning light, straight and unhurried, keeping their own counsel. She had spent 3 years learning not to imagine a future. The habit had been necessary. It had protected her from the specific pain of wanting things she could not have, of reaching and being reminded of the reach. She had learned to live inside the day she was in and not the ones ahead. Standing here, being offered a future that was hers to shape, frightened her in a way that 3 years of Carrington House, of Victoria's soft cruelties, and Madison's cold precision, and Zoe's thoughtless impulsiveness, had never frightened her. Because cruelty she understood. She knew its weight and its shape, and exactly how it moved. Choice was different. Choice required her to decide what she believed she deserved. She was still learning that. "I will stay," she said, quietly, with the care of someone saying something for the first time that they have needed to say for a long time. "I want to pursue the legal matter, and I would like," she paused, "I would like to see what this could be, if that is still something you are offering." "It is," he said, and the evenness of his voice carried something that was warmer than certainty and more honest than performance. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the window again. Later, alone briefly in the East Wing guest room before the afternoon's proceedings, she opened her father's duffel bag for the first time since her arrival. The fraying strap, the carefully mended buckle, she set it on the chair and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the room around her, the fire, the proper mirror, the view of the Kingston forest through the window, the breakfast tray that was still on the table, the small pot of honey she had touched without asking anyone's permission. She did not pick the bag up again. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing worth having tends to be. The courtship between Scarlett and Nicholas proceeded in the careful, honest way of two people who respect each other enough not to rush the process and have too much genuine regard for one another to perform it. There were walks in the Kingston forest when the weather permitted, in the particular quiet of old pine trees that have been standing long enough to have their own opinions. There were evenings in the library, which Scarlett now used with the ease of someone who has been given permission and has decided to believe it. There were long conversations about pack welfare, territory management, the kind of decisions that a Luna makes every day that are never seen by anyone and are entirely the point. Nicholas was not perfect. He was too private by instinct, too controlled by habit, with the specific difficulty of someone who has spent so long managing everything from behind a careful surface that they have almost forgotten how to let anyone see past it. He had to learn, slowly and not always gracefully, that there was someone across from him who deserved the interior of him as well as the exterior. He was learning. He was genuinely willing to learn. Scarlett had come to understand in those weeks that willingness is the thing that matters. Anyone can manage perfection on a good day. What a person does on the days when they are wrong about something, whether they own it, whether they try, that is the actual information. She was not perfect either. She was stubborn in the particular way of people who have had to be stubborn to survive, who have learned that softness gets things taken from them, and have not yet fully relearned that softness offered to the right person in the right room is not the same risk. She still sometimes woke in the night with the cold certainty that the morning would show it all to be a mistake, that she would open her eyes and be back in the narrow room near the utility space with the window that got 2 hours of grey light, and she would lie in the darkness of the East Wing guest room and work through the evidence of the past weeks until the feeling passed. It always passed. The legal matter was resolved over the following months through Matthew Prescott's careful, thorough work. Victoria, presented with the full documented record, and a clear indication that formal proceedings would be both thorough and public, agreed to an arrangement that restored what could be restored. The terms were private. The outcome was not. Scarlet did not see Victoria again for several years. When she did, at a territory gathering in the spring, Victoria inclined her head. Scarlet inclined hers in return. There was nothing more to say, and they were both, in their own very different ways, people who had learned the value of not saying more than was necessary. Madison entered a mating arrangement with an alpha from the Northern Territories. He was not particularly interested in her, and she was not particularly interested in him. They maintained a correct and quiet household, and did not discuss Kingston Hall except in the most general terms, at the few gatherings where their paths crossed. Zoe was different. In the spring, a letter arrived for Scarlet at Kingston Hall. It was not long, and it was not elegant. It did not seek forgiveness in the way that performance seeks an audience. It said, plainly, that Zoe had known what she and Madison were doing was wrong while she was doing it, and that she had done it anyway, and that she was sorry. It did not ask for anything in return. Scarlet read it twice. Then she sat for a while at the library writing table and thought about her father, who had believed all the way down to the place where people keep their most certain things, that how you treated people when no one was watching was the truest measure of who you were. She wrote back, briefly and without coldness, because cruelty in return was not something she was willing to add to the world. They did not become close. That bridge had been taken apart too thoroughly to rebuild into what it might have been, but the wound between them became, over time, scar tissue rather than an open place. Scars, at least, have healed. Grace Prescott became a quiet, steady presence in Scarlet's life. She visited Kingston Hall in the months that followed, not as a social performance, but because she and Scarlet had recognized something in each other in the moments when it mattered, and had decided it was worth keeping. She never became one of the grand social figures her mother had hoped she would. She became something considerably more valuable, a person of genuine kindness and practical usefulness who could be trusted to tell the truth. Nora Whitaker was made the head of Scarlet's personal household staff, because Nora was both excellent at the work and genuinely content in it, and because Scarlet had learned, in the hard, specific way of personal experience, that people who are both capable and happy should be given every possible opportunity to remain so. They were mated in late winter, a small ceremony by the standards of an Alpha King's bonding. The pack's inner circle, the Kingston Forest, at dawn, when the trees were still carrying the last of the night's frost, a breakfast at the hall afterward, with firelight and real conversation, and no performance required of anyone. Nicholas had asked Scarlet what she wanted. She had said she wanted something real rather than something impressive. He had agreed without a moment's hesitation. When the last of the guests had gone, and the hall had returned to its evening quiet, Scarlet stood in the entrance corridor of Kingston Hall. Her home, her hall hers, a word she was still learning to say without a slight internal adjustment of disbelief, and understood with the specific and permanent clarity of something finally, genuinely settled, that the people in this house were hers to care for, and the responsibilities she now held were not a performance. They were a purpose. She had not known she was allowed that. On the 1-year anniversary of the presentation ceremony, exactly 1 year after the sound of tearing silk, and the specific weight of a king's cloak settling on her shoulders in the cold silver light of the ceremonial chamber, Nicholas brought her into the library. He set a volume on the reading table in front of her. It was old, bound in dark leather, its spine worn smooth with age and handling. Inside the front cover, in the careful handwriting of someone who had spent years annotating what they read, were several pages of notes written in faded ink. This belonged to the second Luna of Kingston, Nicholas said. According to the family records, She managed this territory alone for 11 years while the Alpha was abroad. The records of those years suggest she was the most effective administrator the Kingston line has ever had. He paused. The margins of her books are full of what she noticed. Scarlet looked at the open pages, the small, careful annotations, the questions written beside passages that had surprised her. The observations recorded in a hand that was clearly accustomed to writing things down, because it believed writing things down was how you kept them. She held the book for a long moment without speaking. "Thank you," she said. "I would be glad," he said, "if you would add your own notes in time, when you have opinions about it." "I already have opinions," she said. "I know," he said. And the almost smile came, the one she had learned to read over a year of careful attention, the one that was not visible in his face, so much as in the particular quality of his stillness. The sense of something released in a very small, very controlled way. That was the point. She pressed the book briefly to her chest. Some things carry weight beyond their physical form. This one carried the specific weight of being given, not despite what she was, but because of it. She set it on the library table and opened it to the first blank page of the margin near the front. She reached for a pen from the writing set by the lamp, her lamp, in her library, in her home. She began to write. They tore her gown to prove she did not belong among them. They did it in front of every alpha and elder and watching eye the territory had to offer, with the certainty of people who had never once been wrong about who mattered and who did not. But the king's cloak had done what their cruelty could not prevent. It had shown the whole pack what Nicholas Kingston had seen from the beginning, that Scarlett Montgomery had never been beneath the room. She had simply been waiting for one honest man to stop looking past her. And then, quietly, without announcement, in the way of things that last, she had become everything she was always going to be. She set the pen down. Outside the library windows, the winter forest held its deep, particular stillness, the kind that is not silence, but the absence of anything, unnecessary, the kind that has been building for a long time and intends to continue. Inside, the fire burned in the grate, and the books waited on their shelves, and the man who had seen her clearly, from a rest-stop forecourt on a grey October morning, sat across the reading table from her with the warm, steady patience of someone who has arrived at exactly the right place. She looked at the window, at the forest, at the clean white margins of the page. She picked up the pen again. She had a great deal still to write, if you stayed until the very last word. Thank you. Truly, stories like this one only reach as far as the people who carry them forward, and you carried this one all the way to the end. If Scarlett's story moved you, please give this video a like. It takes 1 second, and it means more to this channel than you know. And if you are not already part of this community, subscribe right now, because there are more stories coming, and every single one of them is made for someone exactly like you. One question before you go, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city, your country, wherever you are. I read every single one. You would be surprised how far these stories travel. I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourself.